Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something pretty stark, a really critical geopolitical question. What could actually happen if India and Pakistan got into a direct military conflict?
It's a heavy topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, strategy or hardware. We're talking about the lives and safety of millions of people on both sides.
Yeah.
The potential for disaster is, well, it's huge.
Absolutely. It's a scenario everyone hopes stays theoretical, right?
Mhm.
But understanding the region means we have to look at these potential fault lines. And based on the material we've reviewed, our goal today is to sort of dissect why many analyses suggest Pakistan faces significantly higher risks in that kind of situation.
Exactly. The sources we looked at paint a pretty detailed, maybe sobering picture across a lot of different areas. We're going to dig into the differences in military strength, not just sheer numbers, but, actual capability. We'll explore the economic stability gap, which is pretty fundamental, and how that might play out if things dragged on.
Yeah, endurance is key.
And geography itself, how the land shapes the potential conflict.
Hmm.
Then, of course, the nuclear question. It always hangs over
The
this.
nuclear shadow, yeah. It adds a whole different layer of risk.
We'll also touch on international support, who can rely on whom, internal pressures within each country, logistics, which is maybe less glamorous but crucial.
Absolutely vital. Supply lines win wars.
Right. And the conventional forces, planes, ships, tanks, how their populations are spread out or concentrated, and even thinking ahead what recovery might look like.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. So the mission for you, listening, is to get a clear, concise handle on these key differences, these asymmetries, and what they could mean. Okay, so where do we start? Maybe the most obvious place. Military power. The numbers alone seem, well, they tell a story.
They really do. I mean, the first thing that jumps out is just the sheer resource difference. Defense spending for 2024, India's looking at around $80 billion.
80 billion. Wow. And Pakistan.
Closer to $10 billion.
So an 8-to-1 ratio, roughly.
Exactly. And that's not just, a number on a page. It translates directly into capability. India fields a much larger active military, about 1.4 million personnel,
Compared to Pakistan's.
around 650,000. But maybe even more critical than just the numbers of soldiers is what that extra money buys in terms of tech.
Right. It's not just about having more boots on the ground, is it? The sources talk about a real qualitative difference. Better gear.
That's the key. India has access to and has been acquiring more modern fighter jets, more advanced missile systems, things with better range, better accuracy, stuff like the Rafale jets, for instance.
Those French jets, yeah. They've got advanced radar, better missiles.
Exactly. Superior capabilities in the air. Now, Pakistan has a very capable military, don't get me wrong, and they've invested a lot in their own defense production, too.
Sure.
But the scale of India's budget just allows for faster modernization, buying more cutting-edge stuff across the board, air, sea, land.
So if a conflict wasn't over quickly, if it became a sustained fight,
Then Pakistan would likely find it increasingly difficult to match India's tech advantages and just the overall weight of numbers and firepower. India could probably project power more effectively, sustain operations longer.
okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears then. Another huge factor,
Yeah.
the economy. You mentioned the resource gap in military spending, but the overall economies are also vastly different, right?
Oh, massively different. It underpins everything else, really. A nation's ability to actually absorb the shock of war depends heavily on its economic strength. India's GDP in 2024, ballpark $3.4 trillion. Pakistan's is around $340 billion.
So again, roughly a 10-to-1 difference. That's huge.
It is. And practically speaking, a bigger economy means more capacity to, produce war materials, fund the actual fighting, and just generally cope with the disruption war causes.
And our sources pointed out that Pakistan is already facing some pretty serious economic headwinds, didn't they? High prices, currency issues, needing international loans.
Exactly. Existing vulnerabilities. High inflation hitting people hard. A weak rupee making imports expensive. They're already navigating choppy waters.
So throwing a war on top of that.
It would be like pouring gasoline on a fire, economically speaking. Trade would seize up. Essential imports fuel, food, medicine, never mind weapons, could become incredibly scarce, incredibly expensive. The cost of just running the war itself, paying troops, replacing equipment, fixing damage would put immense strain on Pakistan's finances. You could see foreign reserves drain very quickly.
Making it hard to buy anything from abroad, including more weapons or spare parts.
Precisely. Whereas India, while definitely not immune to the economic costs of war, it would be damaging for them too, no question.
But that bigger, more diverse $3.4 $1.4 trillion economy gives them more of a buffer.
A much bigger cushion, yes. A larger industrial base, bigger internal market, better access to global capital. They'd likely be able to manage the costs and sustain the effort for longer without facing total economic collapse.
Okay, that economic picture is pretty stark. Let's connect this to something more physical, the actual geography. How does the map itself play into these risks?
Right, the physical landscape. This is another area where the sources highlight a disadvantage for Pakistan. It comes down to strategic depth.
Strategic depth, meaning
How much space you have between your border and your vital centers, your big cities, your industrial hubs, your key military bases. If you look at Pakistan, especially its eastern border with India, many major population centers and critical infrastructure points are relatively close to that border.
like Lahore. How close are we talking?
Lahore is very close. Often we're talking 50 to 100 kilometers, maybe a bit more for some assets, but it's a comparatively narrow band.
So not much room to absorb an initial push or attack. Left warning time.
Exactly. There's less of a buffer zone. This proximity potentially makes these key areas more vulnerable to, say, a rapid ground offensive or quicker airstrikes early in a conflict.
Then India, just by virtue of its size.
It has much greater strategic depth. More room to maneuver forces, more layers of defense to protect key cities and infrastructure farther from the border, more options to disperse assets, fall back, regroup if needed. It's a significant geographical advantage.
Okay. Military, economy, geography,
Yeah.
all pointing towards bigger challenges for Pakistan. Now, the elephant in the room?
Eh.
Nuclear weapons. Both sides have them.
Yeah, and this is where things get incredibly dangerous, obviously. The estimates we see put the arsenal sizes roughly comparable, maybe Pakistan slightly ahead, on numbers around 170 warheads versus India's 160 or so for 2024.
Roughly parity then, numbers-wise. But there are differences in doctrine or delivery.
Yes, significant ones. India has been focusing, it seems, on developing a more robust second strike capability.
Can you quickly explain what that means?
Second strike.
Sure. It's basically the ability to absorb a nuclear attack and still be able to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. It relies on having delivery systems that are hard to find and destroy in a first strike, things like nuclear submarines carrying ballistic missiles. So it makes a first strike against you less appealing, because you know retaliation is likely guaranteed. It enhances deterrence.
Exactly. Now, Pakistan's stated doctrine is a bit different. It includes the possibility of using smaller, so-called tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield.
Tactical nukes. Smaller yield.
Smaller yield, yeah, but still nuclear. The idea, reportedly, is that they might use these if they felt they were being completely overrun by India's larger conventional forces. It's sometimes called an asymmetric escalation strategy.
But the risk there, using any nuclear weapon.
Is enormous. It crosses a huge threshold. The danger of uncontrollable escalation to full-scale nuclear exchange is incredibly high. Even a limited use could be catastrophic.
And given what you said about geography and population centers.
Right. Pakistan's population is more concentrated in fewer, larger cities, some near the border. India's population is vast, but more spread out. So the impact of even a limited nuclear exchange could be disproportionately devastating for Pakistan in terms of civilian casualties and societal disruption.
It's a terrifying calculation. Okay, moving away from the direct conflict aspects for a moment. What about the world stage? International relations. Who would have more support?
That's another factor where the sources suggest an imbalance. Pakistan has a very important relationship with China. That's undeniable.
A key strategic ally for them.
Absolutely. But the analyses we looked at raise questions about how far China would go in terms of direct military intervention in a full-blown India-Pakistan war. There's uncertainty there.
And beyond China.
Ties with the U.S. have been, well, complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes strained. Support from other Western nations might also be limited or conditional. Overall, Pakistan doesn't seem to have a wide network of powerful, guaranteed military allies for this specific scenario.
And India.
India seems to have cultivated broader strategic partnerships. It has strengthening ties with the U.S., maintains a long-standing relationship with Russia, and engages with many other countries across Europe and Asia.
So potentially more options for diplomatic support, maybe even military supplies or intelligence sharing in a crisis.
That's the assessment, yes. More potential sources of support. In a major conflict, Pakistan might find itself facing greater international isolation, both diplomatically and materially.
Which could definitely compound problems, especially if they're also facing challenges internally. Let's talk about that internal stability.
Right, this is another crucial layer. Pakistan has a history of periods of political instability, changes in leadership, and tension between civilian and military authorities.
And ongoing security issues, too.
Yes, definitely. Internal security challenges remain, like extremist groups, and there's unrest in regions like Balochistan. A major external war could easily worsen these internal problems.
How so?
Well, it could divert military attention and resources away from the external enemy to deal with internal security flare-ups. It could exacerbate political divisions or fuel separatist sentiments. It adds another layer of strain.
And India, comparatively.
While India certainly has its own internal challenges and complexities, its governmental structure is generally seen as more stable and established. This could allow for a more unified national focus during an external crisis.
Okay, so add internal pressures to the list of potential vulnerabilities for Pakistan. Now, something you mentioned earlier, logistics. Getting supplies where they need to go.
Absolutely critical. You can have the best soldiers and weapons, but if you can't get them fuel, ammo, food, you're in trouble. The sources really highlight Pakistan's dependence on a few key logistical points. The port of Karachi is paramount. A huge amount of imports come through there.
So if Karachi's port operations were disrupted,
Yes.
say by a naval blockade or airstrikes,
It could have a crippling effect, severely disrupting the flow of essential goods, both military and civilian. And it's not just the port. A lot of Pakistan's main road and rail networks also run relatively close to that Indian border.
making them easier to target, to interdict.
Potentially, yes. More vulnerable to disruption compared to a network spread over a larger area with more distance from the front lines.
And India's logistical setup.
Benefits from scale and geography again. Multiple major ports along a very long coastline. A more extensive and strategically deeper road and rail network. There's more redundancy.
Meaning if one route or port is hit, there are other options. More resilience.
Exactly. Better resilience in their supply chains. So, Pakistan's more concentrated, border-adjacent logistics look like another significant risk factor in a prolonged conflict.
Okay, we're building a comprehensive picture here. Let's get back to the direct military matchup, but focus on conventional forces. Air Force, Navy.
Right, beyond just the overall numbers and budget. In the air, the sources point to a clear Indian advantage. Not just more planes, maybe over 600 fighter jets to Pakistan's 400-ish.
But better planes, too. You mentioned the Rafales earlier.
Yes, more modern, capable aircraft overall. This gives India a potential edge in achieving air superiority, controlling the skies, which is often decisive in modern warfare. Better capacity for ground attack missions as well.
And on the seas, the navies.
Yeah. A similar imbalance. The Indian Navy is significantly larger and more powerful. Crucially, it operates aircraft carriers.
Which Pakistan doesn't have.
Correct. Aircraft carriers give India the ability to project air power far out into the ocean, control sea lanes.
And potentially blockade Pakistani ports, like Karachi.
That's a major potential capability, yes. Controlling the maritime space around Pakistan could severely impact their trade and ability to receive supplies by sea. So air and naval power seem to clearly favor India.
Okay, now let's consider the human cost again, but through the lens of demographics. Where people actually live.
This is a really sobering point. Pakistan has a large population, around 240 million people. But a significant chunk of that population lives in a relatively small number of major cities.
And many of those cities are where?
Close to the border, like Lahore, or on the coast, like Karachi. These densely populated urban areas are also often key economic or strategic centers.
Making them potential targets and incredibly vulnerable.
Extremely vulnerable. A major conflict involving attacks on these cities could lead to absolutely massive civilian casualties and potentially trigger huge flows of refugees, internally displaced people.
A humanitarian crisis on a massive scale.
Yes. And Pakistan, with its existing economic constraints and resource limitations, would likely find it incredibly difficult to manage such a large-scale emergency.
Whereas India, with 1.4 billion people,
Yeah.
obviously any attack is devastating, but the population is spread over a much, much larger area.
Correct. Greater geographical dispersion. While the human cost would still be immense for India, too, the concentration of Pakistan's population in fewer, more exposed major centers likely amplifies the potential for catastrophic civilian impact there.
Okay, so we've looked at the conflict itself from many angles. What about after? If the fighting stopped? The recovery.
The path back from conflict is always incredibly hard. But again, the sources suggest it would be significantly harder for Pakistan.
Because of the economic factors we discussed earlier.
Primarily, yes. Rebuilding destroyed infrastructure roads, bridges, power plants, homes, restoring basic services, replenishing military equipment that's been lost or damaged. All of this costs an enormous amount of money. For Pakistan's already strained economy, finding the resources for this massive reconstruction effort would be a monumental challenge.
Likely meaning more debt, more reliance on international aid.
Very likely. It could deepen existing economic problems, potentially leading to years, maybe decades, of slow recovery and instability.
And for India, still costly, obviously, but
But likely a faster recovery path. That larger, more resilient economy, the bigger industrial base, greater access to finance. It suggests India would have a greater capacity to absorb the costs and mobilize resources for reconstruction. It wouldn't be easy, but the trajectory looks comparatively better.
so when we pull all these threads together, military, economic, and geographic, nuclear risks, international standing, internal issues, logistics, conventional forces, population density, recovery prospects, what's the big takeaway from the sources?
The consistent picture, really, is one of asymmetry. While any war between India and Pakistan would be catastrophic for everyone involved, let's be absolutely clear on that,
A tragedy no matter what.
an unmitigated tragedy. But the balance of risks, based on the factors outlined in the materials we reviewed, appears tilted significantly against Pakistan. Across almost every domain we've discussed, military capacity, economic resilience, strategic depth, potentially even the impact of nuclear use despite rough arsenal parity, international support, internal stability, logistical robustness, conventional force balance, population vulnerability, and the capacity for post-war recovery. The analysis consistently points to Pakistan facing a substantially higher degree of risk.
It really paints a stark picture of vulnerability on multiple fronts,
It does.
which really underscores, well, it leaves us with a pretty profound thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given these deeply uneven risks, especially the potentially existential level of risk highlighted for Pakistan in these analyses,
Yeah.
the absolute necessity for both countries to find ways to step back, to de-escalate tensions, to actually engage in meaningful dialogue and prioritize peaceful solutions. It just seems more critical than ever.
Absolutely. The stakes, particularly viewed through this lens of asymmetric risk, are just too high for any other path.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.